that are with us for the first time, or for those who have been with us before, welcome to all of you as we prepare for this exciting hour with Catherine, who I'll present to you in a moment. I'm Josephine Braun, and I coordinate the webinars for EDGE, and I'll be walking you through this technology and introducing our presenter this afternoon. This webinar will be recorded, so if you know of anyone who wasn't able to be with us today but would like to think about this material and for whom this would be of special interest, feel free to pass the information along. The recording will be available approximately the week following the webinar. As this webinar had a fee of $9.99, that will also apply to the recording, and those can be purchased, and information about that is available on the website. So how this will work for those that are new, and a brief refresher for those who have joined us for the first time, is that Catherine will lead the webinar today by use of a PowerPoint presentation that she's prepared, and she will communicate with us verbally as well. Unfortunately, participants aren't able to engage us in verbal conversation, but you can pose your comments and questions in the chat pod at the bottom left of the screen, as I see many have already done. To do that, you click on the white bar at the bottom, type in what you would like to say, and then either click enter or click with your mouse the little speech bubble to the right of that bar. And that will enable everybody who is on the webinar with us to see what you have typed and the questions you have. We do encourage you to type questions and comments as you think of them rather than wait, and I will collect them for Catherine and she will respond to them as that suits her presentation style this afternoon. So Barbara just has a question about the presentation being available after the session. Yes, and Catherine, I'll leave that to you to respond to when you come on about whether people will have access to your PowerPoint, and I can find a way to make that available. If you do have any technological concerns, feel free to message me and I will try to work with you to resolve those. To do that, you can send me a private message by clicking the little menu that is found at the top right of your chat box. There are a few lines with a little arrow. If you click that, a drop-down menu appears and there's an option to start chat with, and you can scroll over to find my name, and that will enable a private message to begin. Another way that you can engage with this webinar presentation is by showing your enthusiasm or support for something that Catherine is saying by a series of symbols. And you'll find these at the top of your screen. There's a little figure with a raised hand, and you'll notice an arrow to the right of that figure. If you click that, a drop-down menu appears, and there are some options for you to raise your hand, agree, disagree, or whatever response is suitable to how you might be feeling. So for example, I raise my hand, you'll see the little figure with the raised hand appear beside my name in the attendees pod. To clear that, go back to that drop-down menu, scroll to the bottom, and just clear your status. Finally, we do encourage you to take a moment to fill out your evaluation form. And you can find that on the link here, and you will receive an email after the webinar with a link to the feedback form as well. You can also email edge at united-church.ca. And yes, we need a little guy for the amen. That's a very good point, Linda. So I'm happy to introduce Catherine today, and when she does come on, she will let us know about the PowerPoint presentation, and we'll make that available for you. But preaching is a passion for Catherine, a discipline and a lifestyle. During her MDiv studies at Harvard, she worked with Fred Buchner, whom I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and Peter Gomes. In her D.Min in preaching from McCormick, she was awarded the Hunt Prize for Best Thesis. Hers focuses on content, doctrine specifically, stuff that you want to hear. Catherine is currently the senior minister at St. Paul's United Church in Edmonton and has served congregations in quite a variety of different areas, from Canmore, Yellowknife, New Brunswick, and Toronto. I don't know if you can get much more diverse than that. So it certainly gives you a lot of context in which to practice the ministry of preaching. Catherine preaches and lectures on preaching across the church, most recently in Whitehorse, Berwick Camp, Louisville, Kentucky, the Canadian Theological Society in Queens. She's one of the authors of A Song of Faith. So welcome, Catherine, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Josephine. It's really good to be here. Everybody can hear me all right? I'm assuming that's a yes, that you can hear me okay. Let's open with a moment of prayer. Holy One, you are the beacon in the fog. You are the anchor in the storm. You are the ground under our feet. And you are the word on our lips. Bless us as we anticipate the season of Advent and how we will bring the word to those who are listening. Amen. Thanks for being here. You are welcome to have my PowerPoint, and I could probably most easily get it to you through my email address, which I can share with you later if you want it. So I think if there's anything in the PowerPoint that's going to be of interest, it may be the artwork, a little bit of that. Anyway, entitlement, expectation, and ecstasy, preaching through Advent. The questions that I posed in the outline are my questions, and I hope they will be yours, and that is what has drawn you. I think preparing for Advent is like setting the table for breakfast. We know what to expect. And my question is, do we really know what to expect? Issues of entitlement come fresh in December. Depression slips over the landscape like a North Atlantic fog. In the midst of all this, the ecstatic expressions of Zechariah, Mary, and Elizabeth, not to mention an angel, shake the boots off us and send us running for cover. How do we make these stories matter for people who take the time to show up at church? I am so aware these days that it is a matter of time that people take to come up.
Well, that certainly was a bit of a surprise. We'll just give Catherine a moment to get organized. We have a thorough rehearsal prior to the webinar, but unfortunately we can't always predict technological things that can arise. So I'm just making the PowerPoint available. There is a way to add it to the site here, and I'm just doing that for you so that we don't have to worry about emailing her after the presentation. Okay. You'll just have to forgive me moving around on the screen a little bit here. Well, while we are waiting for Catherine to rejoin us, I welcome you to access her PowerPoint, which I've made available in the little box that you see titled Files. And I think Catherine is here.
I wonder if I'm back. Oh, hi, dear, I am so sorry. I don't know. I am so sorry. Hi, I guess I was talking about how we think about people who show up at church and what it takes, and there I am, poof, disappeared. So I want to talk. I want to talk.
Thinking about that in the context of what you were saying about ecstatic expressions and appearances. I was thinking about that in the context of what you were saying about ecstatic expressions and appearances, and I thought about disappearances. Anyway, we're glad to have you.
Thank you. You're very kind. So one of the things that I am so aware of in preaching and presenting is the difference between preaching and just words. rhetoric is important. Common speech is important. Preaching is bringing the good news. Preaching is a sacred task. Preaching is a calling, and it is a call from God. It's a holy thing. So there is a trepidation. I think it's Annie Dillard who talks about the fear that we should have every time we walk into the pulpit. We should be quite concerned that it's just going to catch fire, because what we're about is so critical. So taking all of that seriously and preparing for Christmas Eve, for ourselves as preachers, for those who are going to gather on Christmas Eve, how do we prepare for this? How do we prepare for this in this day and age when people make an effort to show up? And how do we prepare for it, acknowledging that it is kind of wild and crazy? It's really, well, I believe it changes the world. This piece of artwork is from Florence, probably painted around 1425 by someone called Masolino. It's a picture of St. Peter. Now, St. Peter preached the first Christian sermon. He preached the first Christian sermon. You find it in Acts 2, and following his preaching, 3,000 souls were baptized. Not a mean feat, pretty wild. He based his homily on Joel, on Psalm 16, Psalm 110, Isaiah 57. He certainly, he was a biblical preacher. And the writer of Acts says that the Lord added to their number daily following that. So this is the person in whose shoes, in whose path we are following, whose shoes we are filling. This is St. Peter preaching the first Christian sermon. So I want to ask of you what kind of expectations you have when you're preaching and when you're bringing people to Christmas Eve and looking for Advent. I understand that I'm a little bit muffled, yet loud. So I'm just going to bring my voice down a bit when I don't want to lose you again. And I'm hoping that might be a little bit better. Does that sound a wee bit better, do you think? Anyway, I'm going to keep going, and I hope that it's all right. No, I don't have a cold, but thanks for asking. You're very thoughtful. When I come into Advent every year, my family knows that I am going to say, does anybody want to go to Morocco with me? I would like to flee our North American context. I would like to go to some significantly not Christian culture, and Morocco is the one that springs to mind, not only because it's warm, but because it is a Muslim country, and I won't be dealing with all of the anxieties that I associate with Christmas. But my family has never said, yes, let's go to Morocco. It would be a good season for a holiday to go there. So it leaves me reflecting on why I would like to flee. And it's partly the power of the readings that come to me at Advent, and it's partly, of course, the culture around us. It's as though we took a high holiday and turned it into something self-serving. So I think we need to prepare deeply in order to do Advent thoroughly, so that when people come to Christmas, there is an openness to what the Spirit is really leading us to. So what I'd like to do is to take a preaching point for each of the 4 weeks that are ahead of us. And my wisdom in preaching is always read the passage and find the one that grabs you or astonishes you or frightens you, that knocks your socks off, that sends you running for cover. Pick up the one that is weird and unusual, that perplexes you, because if I'm really engaged in the passage that I'm reading, then obviously I'm going to have something a little more helpful for people who are listening, because I'm going to be really interested. I'm not going to be bored. And I still encounter people who say, when I grew up, I didn't know the sermon was something to listen to. I expected to be bored. It was my time to think to myself. And there's nothing wrong with thinking to ourselves, but I think we as preachers then have a duty to make sure that it's certainly not boring. If I'm not bored in the preparation, I think there's good reason to think that people will not be bored in the in receiving it and in the listening. So what I'm going to offer for these 4 weeks is moving away a little bit from the lectionary. A lectionary is a wonderful, wonderful tool. Here at St. Paul's, we left it 8 years ago because we acknowledged that over the course of 21 or 24 years, we'd been through it 6 or 7 times. And as much as it's a marvelous tool and unites us ecumenically, that we were missing the big stories. So we've done an annual theme. We focused on Moses 1 year, Esther another year, Ruth another year, Joshua and the judges getting back into the promised land, that kind of stuff. The Tree of Life was last year. So my congregation is quite accustomed to leaving the lectionary behind and focusing on a story. And what I would suggest for this Advent is just to leave aside what's there and let's just go into Luke. Let's just play with Luke in those first 2 chapters that bring us toward Christmas, that bring us into Advent very, very deeply. I think they bring us the questions of meaning, and the stories are so awe-inspiring themselves that we really don't need to go anywhere else. Fred Buechner has a story in his book called Home about his call to ministry, and he writes about being in New York City and listening to George Buttrick week after week as he was living in New York City. And George Buttrick preached a Christmas Eve sermon in which his ongoing theme was, are you going home for Christmas? Are you going home for Christmas? And what does it mean to go home for Christmas? And the first time I heard Fred talk about this, I was living in northern New Brunswick, and I was not going home for Christmas. I had a rural 3-point charge. I needed to be there for Christmas Eve. I had services to conduct, all that kind of thing. So I was not going home to the place I called home. I was in my new home. But what he writes about more importantly is that it's not just about the place where we grew up or where our familiar people are or where our work is, but our home is in Christ. So if we are going home for Christmas, what we are bringing people to through the 4 Sundays of Advent is leading them home to Christ in that Christmas story. And all of this is so much mythology and amazing storytelling, and so much of it is so old-fashioned that we need to be able to work through the layers of stuff that are on that, bring people back into what Luke was really saying, and then bring people the opportunity to actually bring it home on Christmas Eve or the week after Christmas, whenever they are free to think about spiritual questions. So those are the kinds of questions of meaning I think we can really get at in this Advent preaching that we are embarking on this year. I think this is one of our big issues, entitlement. And I think that the reason we have some trouble with entitlement is because there is a significant link with this word, sin. And in the United Church, I'm not sure what's happening in Chicago these days in your denomination, but Linda, but in the United Church, sin has not been one of the words that we've been most comfortable with. We've found other words to use instead. A lot of people have stepped away from prayers of confession. We certainly, when I started to write my thesis and was working on ideas about sin, people, whether it was clergy, academics, members of my congregation, lay people in Presbyterian Conference, immediately came back and said, well, I don't believe in original sin, I believe in original blessing. Well, yes, great, original blessing, Matthew Fox. We are, according to Genesis 1, created in God's image, and that is very, very good. There is something about our human nature, however, that is drawn toward selfishness, self-aggrandizement, revenge, betrayal, all those things that are quite quite real, I think. And I think what we have an opportunity to do in Advent, when we have more people showing up in November, lots of newcomers, lots of old-timers coming back because they're getting ready for Christmas, and going to church is a good idea, and so on. We have an opportunity to talk about stuff that's really real. In the United Church, we're afraid of frightening people away with language like sin. But I think when we talk about what is real in our lives, sorrow, grief, betrayal, the awful things that we do to one another, on a personal scale, on a civic scale, on a global scale, then people who are listening catch on and go, yeah, this is true. This is not just naive religion. This is not just old-fashioned stories. This is true because it's true for me. It's true for me when I hurt people. It's true for me when people hurt us. So I think that what we need to be doing is facing our human nature. And in Advent, we have a great opportunity to face our human nature. I want you to look at this artwork. This is from Colmar. Colmar is in the Alsace. If you've done the wine route kind of in the edge of France and Germany, that's where this is. So in the Alsace of France. And I bring you this picture because we're looking at an altarpiece. And as you see this, the wings of it move. They open. The underneath part in front of that gentleman open. So what we've got here is obviously the stories toward the end of Jesus' life and beyond the crucifixion, and underneath we've got the tomb. But it opens up, and this is what we see when it opens up. Isn't that a substantial difference? Look at the difference. That is very, well, it's red, but it's kind of gloomy. And if we look here, we've got something that's full of brilliance. Now, this piece was done sort of during the Black Plague, so that's why some of that green stuff appears. But that's how the altarpiece opens up. And obviously on the right, we've got this gorgeous resurrection. Jesus is bursting out of the tomb. What I want to draw your attention to are the pictures, the paintings on the left. So obviously we have the Annunciation, and then we have the angel singing. Isn't that great that she's got a cello? And the piece, the third piece from the left, of course, is Mary with the baby. So let's just take this a little bit closer. And here we've got the Mary with the baby and the angel singing. Now I want you to look over the angel with the cello. There's all that gorgeous color. A lot of it is white. There's a wash basin there. There's all kinds of the meaning and metaphor in this is outstanding. But I want you to look for that dark shadow over the angel. It's kind of an odd-looking dark shadow. Dark shadows are symbolic, right? In this painting, the Eisenheim altarpiece, in this painting, the dark shadow is Satan. And the concept is that the advent of our God, God becoming human, was so astonishing, so compelling, that even the devil showed up. Isn't that outstanding? Even the devil showed up at the birth of Jesus because this is such an astonishing thing. Now, I think that's absolutely outstanding. My point today is that even as we are going through Advent and awaiting the advent of our God, all of our human nature shows up. The part of us that is pulled toward selfishness, self-aggrandizement, all that kind of stuff shows up. So, if we choose to preach in Advent about the things about us that are wrong, that are compelling, that draw us, in the light of God's love, in the light of being good, in the light of being made in God's image, then I think we get to something that is real, that we resound with at the root of who we are. Anybody got a question to this point, or anything you want to add in that isn't technical?
I don't see anything yet, Kat. Catherine. I think we're
all right. Well, there she is, with all kinds of jubilation, strings and the lyre, all of that gorgeous biblical music that happens as we prepare to greet God. And there over her shoulder is that dark shadow who also is called with astonishment to see this extraordinary thing that God is making happen. One of you is from St. John's, and this is certainly where I'm from, is the North Atlantic. I'm a Maritimer. And I know what happens when the fog comes in. There's a fog line. My parents' home was just above the fog line, and I could walk from my parents' home to the place where my dad's church was and walk into the fog. And there are issues of depression and anxiety and expectations and grief and betrayal and loss and sorrow and memory, all of which seem to come and sink around us in December like the North Atlantic fog. How do we walk people through that? This is the portion from the Song of Faith that has to do with worship. The line that I have highlighted in bold at the bottom, God changes our lives, our relationships, and our world. I believe to the very bones in my feet that this happens in worship, and that's why I want to go to Morocco. That's why we should be worried about getting into the pulpit, because it's going to catch fire, because things happen in worship that do change the world, and we offer it as all of these things that are true in the Song of Faith. Understanding that what we're doing is not simply habit, not simply beauty, not simply community, although those are all excellent things, but in worship, God makes change. And I just, that is outstanding. That is just completely outstanding, and I think it is the most important thing about what we do. So this is why I think we do have ecstatic expressions. And sometimes we read the stories at the beginning of Luke. We read about Zechariah and how he was silenced. We read about Elizabeth, this old lady who was going to have a baby. We read about Mary, who'd never known a man. We have all these stories, and we kind of go, well, you've got to be kidding. This is just kind of ancient stuff. But I believe that there's ecstasy in it, that it does take us out of ourselves. This is an experience I had recently. That's the Edmonton Eskimos on the field there. We won. Okay, we went against Saskatchewan. And there was a feeling on that football field. I have to tell you, first of all, I'm not really a sports fan. But I felt in Commonwealth Stadium this sense of 30,000 people completely outside themselves. They were having an ecstatic experience. There was a common feeling. They were enjoying one another's company, but there was something happening that was greater than themselves. There was an ecstasy in it that was completely contagious and pretty wild. This is my favorite pizzeria here in the city, Famosa. Studies show that eating pizza causes feelings of euphoria. Disclaimer, we made this up, but the pizza's delicious, we promise. Euphoria, ecstasis, being out of ourselves. Do we believe that we're part of making that happen? Do we believe that we who are called into the pulpit on Sundays are part of making that happen? I think so. It happened to Mary. So if we believe that, let's just break out into it. And there are a lot of ways of doing this in the sermon. Part of it is, as you get to know people, they trust you more and more and more. And so you can say who you are, you can say it with conviction, and they will believe you. The other thing that you can do is you can be a little unlike yourself and break out into something that catches people's attention because it's different. Maybe you leave the pulpit because you never do that. Maybe you go into the pulpit because you never do that. Maybe you talk about football because you never do that. Maybe you sing in the middle of your sermon. If you're going to do that, practice, but it's a great idea. Reciting the scripture is a great idea. Just get it by memory. Walk into the middle of the chancel, hold the microphone in your hand, close your eyes, and just recite the Magnificat. No notes. Just recite it. You can do it. You've probably read this thing thousands of times. Just memorize it, go out and do it. Talk to your choir. Ask them if they would interrupt your sermon. So they've got a cue. You get partway along, you're impassioned, you're preaching away, and all of a sudden the choir stands out and they burst into a setting of the Magnificat. You look astonished as though you had no idea this was going to happen. The congregation is amazed. What they see is the choir so engaged in the Word of God that they have just stood up and obviously just are improvising with a recitation of the Magnificat in music and harmony. You can bring ecstasy into that 20-minute sermon with these kinds of little tools. And it matters because you are saying, look at these outstanding people in Scripture. Luke wrote about Zechariah and Elizabeth, and they took risks. He wrote about Mary. Look what she did. Look what she did. The risk that she took and all of that. And we are, preachers in the 21st century. We're postmodern people. We put gas in our cars. We worry about the pipeline. We're concerned about Israel and Palestine. We've got children to look after and church budgets and all that kind of stuff. And in the middle of all of those worries, we just stand up there and do this thing that looks absolutely outstanding, absolutely foolish. And you know what? People are going to love it because you are taking a risk. You are embodying what Luke said these individuals do. And so you do something that's unusual. Or maybe you are an absolutely gorgeous singer. And your congregation knows that. And so it's not a risk for you to sing, but what you're doing then is you're sharing the beauty of your sacred gift in that kind of way. So what are we doing? We're catching people's attention. We're saying, I am just magnifying the Lord. I am so excited about this stuff. I really want you to be listening to this. So I'd like to look for a minute or more than a few minutes actually, at the 4 readings that we have coming up and what we might want to do with them. So my suggestion to you is that we break the 4 Advent weeks into 4 readings out of Luke. And the first one is the whole Zechariah Elizabeth story. So it's written in 2 parts in Luke. The interruption is the Annunciation, Mary with the angel. But I suggest that you pull the whole thing, pull the whole Zechariah Elizabeth story and recite it, tell it, break it up into a couple of parts, have people act it out, but use the whole thing on the 2nd of December so that everybody is doing Zechariah and Elizabeth for the whole service. Put the carols and the music around that suits, but just do Zechariah and Elizabeth. And Isaiah's fabulous, Mark's fabulous, the little apocalypse is fabulous, but this year just give it a break. Just let it behind and just do Zechariah and Elizabeth. It's not a short story. And you can say to people, look, this is a long story. So, settle back, relax, follow along on page 1 in the New Testament if you want to, however you want to do that. But let people settle in and get the story. Tell the story. It was meant to be told. So tell the story, take the time, break it up if you want to, but just tell the story. And I would suggest to you that a preaching point from Zechariah and Elizabeth could be the old ushering in the new. The old ushering in the new. So we've got these 2 lovely old people who are so faithful and lovely, and you would just like to kind of embrace them, right? I mean, if they were in your church, you'd make sure that they got picked up and driven to church every week because everybody loves them and wants them there. They are the faithful. They're the ones who made sure that there were candles on the communion table every week. They're the ones who made sure that newcomers got greeted. They're the ones who have always been there. They are the old people, and they are ushering in the new. For us these days, there is a huge question about what is old for us. How do we offer that in a new age? This whole postmodern thing, all the newcomers that we're welcoming with the emerging spirit. What is it in our tradition that welcomes the new hearts? And obviously, from what I've been saying earlier, I think that there's a lot there about sin and entitlement that we can offer in a way that doesn't scare people, but that embraces the wholeness of who they are. So I would suggest to you that just play with Elizabeth and Zechariah. They are such lovely people. Welcome them in, and then talk about the old ushering in the new and what that means for our church in the 21st century. The second week, I would say, just let Mary do it. That Annunciation, the angel and Mary. It's not a long piece, and so people who arrive on that second week, the 9th of December, are not going to have a whole lot of scripture. So you could do it a couple of ways. You could have the congregation sing one of the settings that's in the Magnificat in the hymn book. You could have the choir presented in a couple of ways, an old-fashioned way, a more refreshed way. You could have different voices reading it. But to play with that in the Magnificat is, well, it's just gorgeous. And it'll knock your socks off. Mary is so, well, she's a number of things, but she's very brave. The angel is the other character there that you can play with. It would appear that angels in, kind of 1st, 2nd century were free creatures. They might have been messengers from God, but Paul doesn't talk a lot about angels. And when Paul, who was earlier than Luke, writes about angels, he doesn't talk about them as being good. He has some kind of leery sense about angels. So I think that you can present that angels are free creatures. This angel, Gabriel, chooses to show up with some good news. Okay? Now, is there something in there for us? Do we choose? Do we have a choice as free creatures to show up with good news or bad news? I think we do. So I think that might be an interesting way into that story. And the question then for Mary is, who do you trust? Do you trust this free creature, Gabriel, who has just kind of appeared with this ridiculous concept? Or do you trust what you know? Well, we know what she does. But I think that is an outstanding question for people who are going to be showing up on the 9th of December. Who do we trust? When we're concerned about making Christmas right for our families, or making our church relevant in this day and age, or how we're going to deal with another Christmas with the kinds of personal histories that we have, all the kinds of questions that people bring that makes them want to go to Morocco during the Christmas season, with all the stuff that we know that's really, really hard. Who do we trust? So that would be my suggestion as a preaching point for that second week. I would suggest on the third week that we spend that time with Mary and Elizabeth. So we've got the new and the old. And so we're obviously pulling those first couple of chapters of Luke apart and putting them together in a different way. We're not reading the way they're literally written, but that's fine. I mean, whose word is these are our words to work with. And so we've got Mary and Elizabeth. We've got this whole, just a sec, sorry, I've just kind of lost my train of thought for a second because I've got my notes here. What I'd like to do in the third week is to spend that time, well, good for me, I mixed it all up. Here we go. December 9, I'm going to spend with Mary and Elizabeth, and December 16 on the Magnificat. I've just given it to you the other way around. So there you go. You have a good time with whatever you like. What I would do with Mary and Elizabeth, whether it's on the 9th or on the 16th, is to look at the whole thing about, is nothing truly impossible with God? Because that is what old Elizabeth says to young Mary. Nothing is impossible with God. And that part of the scripture really grabs me because I'm not sure I believe it. And that's why I think I need to preach about it. If nothing is impossible with God, how can that possibly be true in the world in which we live, the lives that we live in? And frankly, when we preach, when we're in those fiery pulpits, we're preaching with conviction about what we believe. It is so important also to preach about what we don't know, what our doubts are, what our worries are, what the edges are. Because how are people going to trust us if they think we know the whole thing? Like, we don't know the whole thing. How could we possibly know the whole thing? But when we're honest and say, look, here is an issue in faith that is really important. It's an issue of the old faith, and I'm not sure. Here are my questions. And of course you have to bring into that, this is my conviction in this. So if I'm going to preach, which I am on that Sunday, about nothing will be impossible with God, I need to say, these are the places where I believe that's not true. People who are suffering, obviously. And I need to say, okay, then in the face of that, what do I believe about God that I am bringing to this theological question? and what I do believe about God that I'm bringing to this theological question is that we are made in God's image, and that that is a very good thing. So I have intellect, emotional life, spiritual life, embodied life to bring to my theological question of what does it mean that nothing is impossible with God, when I find that really, really hard to believe. So that brings us to December 23. And on December 23, I'm going to preach the Christmas story. And I'm going to do it for 3 reasons. The first reason is that we always save it for Christmas Eve, like it's this wonderful present that we unwrap, and then it's gone. Then we move on to, December 30, and we're into Jesus in the temple as a baby or something. We've got this really brief time to deal with this outstanding story, and then poof, it's gone. So that's one reason. The second reason is that there's a whole lot of people who will be in church on December 23 who will not be in church on December 24. And I think it's fair to bring them the story. I think it's really important to bring them the story. And the other reason I'm going to preach the Christmas Eve gospel readings from Luke on December 23, which is a Sunday morning, is that there's just so much in there to unpack that we can't do in the romance of a Christmas Eve service. Because there's the Christmas Eve service with all the families, which are really busy. Then there's the Christmas Eve service that's kind of meditative and romantic and candlelit and full of awe and mystery. And then there's all that thing when, there's all the busyness going on because, the teenagers are there and the young people are home from university and people are greeting each other. And so I believe that there's a limited amount that we can take in during the mystery and the beauty of that particular service. So I'm going to preach the Christmas readings then, because I think that's, they merit it. It's really important. So the first week is Zechariah and Elizabeth. The second week, or the third week, is Mary and the angel. The third week, or the second week, is Mary and Elizabeth. And the last week of Advent is the Christmas story itself. That's what I'm going to do, and I would offer it. I would offer it to you as a suggestion. I think you'll have a good time. Anybody want to ask any questions here before I go on to the next bit? Okay, I'll just keep going then. That sound all right, Josephine? All right, good. You have a wonderful smile. I was mentoring someone a number of years ago who said, well, preaching, it's just words, words, words. And, oh my gosh, it is simply words, words, words. But the Word, of course, is the incarnate God in John's Gospel. So the words are tremendously important. And that's why I encourage you to offer them in different kinds of ways, to memorize them, to recite them in the worship service. Now, what I also suggest to you, and maybe you do this already, is to take the passage that you're dealing with, that particular part in any of those 4 readings that perplexes you or makes you angry or that you feel dumbfounded by or frightened of, and memorize it and work with it through the season. Recite it as you're waiting for the train. Play it over and over again in your mind as you're stalled in traffic. Think about it as you're doing the dishes. Just have those words. This is where your preaching becomes your lifestyle. This is where it becomes part of who you are all the time, not just when you're in your study, not just when you're doing pastoral care, not just when you're putting the hymns together with the choir to see if they like them, if they're willing to learn them. But this is where it becomes your story, and the words are your words, and so you're reciting part of the Magnificat or Elizabeth's astonishment or whatever as you are going on, and so they become part of you. And what I want to do is I want to share with you 3 pieces of what I think are outstanding words that are not biblical, because the power of words beyond Scripture, of course, it grabs our hearts and knocks our socks off as well. So the scriptural words are significant. I want to offer you these 3 parts of poetry because others around us and before us have taken the power of words and are continuing to astonish us as well. So the first one is one of my faves, and I want to tell you, when I am at a loss for words, when I bump into the wall and I don't know what I'm going to say, if I'm preparing a funeral homily or a Sunday service, or I'm going to a difficult pastoral visit or whatever, I go to the words, and these are 3 sets of words that I go to. Sometimes I use them in worship, and I love to do that. Sometimes these words simply inspire my own. So the first one is Gerard Manley Hopkins, so written in the late 1800s, and you're welcome to read along. I'm going to suggest, if you like, just sit back for a minute and close your eyes. This poem is called God's Grandeur. The world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out, like shining from shook foil. It gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil, crushed. Why do men then now not reck his rod? Generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil. And wears man's smudge, and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And though the last lights off the black west went, morning at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods with warm breast and with bright wings. Well, that's Hopkins, and that's God's Grandeur. And I have read that in worship with people's eyes closed, if they want to. Sometimes people aren't comfortable. And I have read it to myself when I hit the wall, and I need to be reminded that it's not just my energy. My energy is my gift, but it's God's energy. And that no matter the mistakes I make, when I make the risks that I take on Sunday mornings, and sometimes I do foolish things, but you know what, there's this Holy Ghost that's going to be there over all my bent and broken work, and that is going to find something there that's going to be like that free angel with bright wings. The second piece I want to read you is from Augustine, and I want to read from Augustine because Augustine gets really bad press. Augustine had some formative ideas that made a significant imprint in our church. Bishop of Hippo in Egypt in the late 300s, and when you want to read about kind of the contrast between the Presbyterian Methodist, the free will, and whether God has kind of our days written in a book or on God's hand or something like that, Augustine plays loud and clear in that with the arguments against Pelagius, and it's great stuff. And oh my word, to my surprise, I went back a number of years ago and reread Augustine. Here's a question: how many times do you just go and read theology for the pleasure of reading theology when you're not writing a sermon? Just take it off your shelf, or find it online, or go to a library and just read it because it's your job, because you can take the time to just go and read theology with no expectation that it is going to bring you something that you're going to give somebody else. Just go and read theology. So I was doing that, and I was reading Augustine, and he's so fluent. I think he would be a remarkable opponent in a debate, of course, but he's so fluent. So I want to offer you this poem, mostly because it's Augustine and because I've come to know him not as an opponent, but as a friendly opponent. Late have I loved thee, O beauty, so ancient and so new. Late have I come to love thee, for thou wert with me and I outside. Thou wert within me, yet I not with thee. Thou didst call and cry to me and break through my deafness. Thou didst shine forth, and my darkness was scattered. Thou didst touch me, and I yearned for thy peace. Well, that's Augustine, and I think that is mystery and wonder. There's another piece here by Annie Dillard. Annie Dillard, of course, is a contemporary of ours. She writes in the Appalachians. And I'm going to suggest that it's one that you take away and read on your own from the PowerPoint, because I see that Josephine's made it available to you. It's found in Holy the Firm. Holy the Firm is a really small, thin little book, but the sense that we have to step up. That's what's here, and when I'm losing energy, I read this passage. So I'm going to leave it for you to read on your own. I'm assuming there are people whose words you read, and they're important, so just to put that in your thought. I want to bring you this book by Lillian Daniel and Martin Copenhaver, This Odd and Wondrous Calling. They are two United Church of Christ ministers, and they have written chapters about the work that we do. This will perhaps get you when you bump into the wall. It certainly gets me because it's very real. This is another one that is gorgeous. William Carl has talked to, I would say, the gurus of preaching and pastoral care, and each of them has written what they say is their best advice. It is well worth the $20. I mean, this may be my favorite book on my shelf. I also want to ask you if you read The Christian Century, because if you don't, you should use it. It is the best use of my book allowance money. Here is one issue. And get a load of this title, Sex, the Sacramental View. It comes out every other week. Smack in the middle of it every week is a commentary on lectionary written by amazing minds. So if you do nothing else with your book allowance, go to christiancentury.org, sign up, and have them start sending you that magazine. I've had it for my entire ordained life, and I don't know how I preach without it. The last book I want to share with you, What is the Matter with Preaching Today? The person who put this together used the title from Harry Emerson Fosdick's sermon that he published in 1928 in Harper's Magazine, and he wrote about what's the matter with preaching today. And some of our great gurus have written with the same title. I want you to understand that in the essay that Harry Emerson Fosdick wrote in 1928, he said, what's the matter with preaching today? He said, this is the thing. If you don't have people coming to you after your sermons and asking you to talk about them, if people aren't saying to you, this affects my life, then that's what's the matter with preaching today. And this is what he says. This is what people ought to be saying after your sermon. And this is not judgment. This is how we critique ourselves and constantly work on preaching in a more relevant manner. This is the question that comes to us. How did you know I was facing that problem only this week? That is where these Advent lessons bring us questions of entitlement and expectation and fear and doubts and things that are old and things that are new. That's where our pastoral care, our theology, and our preaching all come together. So I want to finish by telling you about a retreat that I did in Waterton National Park. And I did the retreat about a month after 9/11. So people are obviously kind of freaked out after 9/11, and it was a group of clergy who were gathered. I discovered about the third day into the retreat that my feet were killing me. My ankles were just so sore. I have never had foot problems, but my ankles were so sore. I was putting heat on them, I was putting cold on them, I was wrapping them up, I was putting on my running shoes. I couldn't figure out what it was. My friend Jan Tissondier, who's a singer, was leading the music, and she is part of an a cappella group, and she said, what's happening is your ankles are full of all these little tiny bones. Your ankles are full of little tiny, tiny bones. And when we are together, singing, preaching, leading things, when we are in a group and we are standing together, our ankle bones are the ones that hold us together. She said when she sings with her group in the pink, they can feel in their feet whether they are harmonizing. Isn't that outstanding? I mean, have you ever heard this before? I was just knocked over. What I learned from that is that I was gathering the anxiety of that group of ministers post 9/11 about how we are in this world. All the worries and anxieties were flowing directly into my ankles because I was the worship leader. So my response to that is that we take it in, we acknowledge it, and then we have to stand tall and speak up. What I learned is that we have to stand in mountain pose, okay, the yoga mountain pose, where you are completely straight, your feet are flat on the floor, you are lined up, well, like a mountain. That we stand in mountain pose, we absorb the energies of the people who are listening, and then we speak up. Because it's the story that belongs to the listeners. Because this stuff matters. And what do? Yes, we're going to end up singing Christmas carols through December because it's going to fit, and people are going to love it, and we'll sing Advent and Christmas, and we can do that because it is what is leading us through the Advent, and we are making people's hearts sing. Making people's hearts sing. Making people's heart sing. These are my questions. I hope that they might have been your questions too as you came to this. And I hope that that dark shadow that floats around you and around the people in your congregation and over our world will be so drawn by the truth that you are preaching that you will be aware of the knocking together in your ankles and the fact that even that which is dark shadow around us is drawn to this God who is made real. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Before we close off the webinar, I just want to give anyone who has a question one final opportunity to type that into the chat pod. Catherine, we do have one question. The quote that you read from Augustine, we have someone wondering what the page reference for that was. I don't know if that's something you have handy or not. But
it's from the Confessions, and in my particular, it'll depend on the translation that you've got. I'd be happy to forward that in an email following. It's early in the Confessions, if that's any help. It may be in the first, either the intro or the first or second chapter. But I can find it if someone likes.
Thank you, Catherine. Catherine, you did mention making your email address available, so I'll let you type that into the bar below into the chat pod, and so those who need the page number and can't find it by Googling, perhaps you can send Catherine an email. Catherine McDonald has a question about the PowerPoint, and that is available here now on the screen. If you'll notice, I added a files box, and it's on the right-hand side, right-hand column between the notes and the attendees. And you should be able to get that by clicking and highlighting the title of the PowerPoint and then clicking Save to My Computer. If you have any trouble with that, let me know and we'll try to get that to you another way. Catherine, I just want to echo the thanks and appreciation on behalf of our participants. We have a lot of positive feedback, and Mary Beth particularly says, "You've excited me about Advent preaching once again." And as I've been listening to you, I've been reflecting on what a daunting task this must be for you and to anyone who has been in ministry longer than I have, which isn't too hard to do. But Advent comes year after year, and to find creative ways to read the texts and to hold those in our community of faith and to provide those opportunities for ecstatic experience is a daunting and exciting task. And I like your reflection on the way in which we as ministers and leaders in our congregations and people involved in worship hold the anxieties and the expectations and the fear that comes as we look forward to Christmas. And our task as being people that would point the way to the hope that is to come. So I want to thank you for giving us some thoughts and ideas and ways to think about the task as we approach the Advent season this year. Again, I'll just remind the participants that the recorded version of this webinar will be available on the EDGE website approximately a week following the webinar. You can let your friends know that weren't able to be here today. There's a fee of $9.99 to purchase the recording. Linda's asking whether that will be emailed when it's ready. Our web technician, Sharon, looks after that. I'm not 100% sure what her practice is there, but I can email her and find out about that. Again, we welcome your feedback, so if you have a moment to fill out the feedback form, the link is found at the top right of your screen if you have a moment to do that. And we hope to see you again in the coming weeks as we explore some different topics related to ministry. That's all I have to say. Catherine, I want to thank you again for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you. Thanks for listening so closely, and blessings as we all come to this season that comes up every year. May the free angels bring us trusting communities where we are free to be ourselves and preach the gospel as we know.